Thank you, Jim. I think what you said about me is that I'm overcommitted, which is probably true. It's a privilege to be here looking at a group of serious philosophers and thinkers. A couple of my colleagues with whom I have been in combat in the Pentagon, and we can take that a couple different ways. No, we had fun. As I mentioned to General Whistler when I walked in, it's nice to have a meeting with him in a room that has windows. But in all seriousness, talking about this topic with a group like this kind of reminds me of when I used to think about fighting my way into the Soviet Union in a B-1. It could turn out well or it could turn out badly, but even well, we'll let you judge. But I think really my reason for being up here is to make Dr. French look good because she's the expert on this. But this is a serious topic, and I'm going to address it from more of a practitioner's perspective, and I'm going to talk more about the future than I am about the virtues. But those two things are intimately tied up, as you'll see. I hope and expect that some of the things I say will make you a little uncomfortable, because I'm uncomfortable about some of the dynamics that I see. We have in this country extremely strong military traditions. The issues that we deal with, and I say we because I just haven't quite taken off the uniform yet, probably never will. They're life and death. They're extremely powerful. Civil-military interactions at one level are kind of habitual and emotional, and at a policy level, they're very strongly shaped by organizational boundaries, procedure, and the historical paradigm that our values really represent and reinforce. America's military virtues are learned and lived by millions, and they're perceived by hundreds of millions, and they're about the heart, not the head. So I entirely identify with everything that General Whistler said this morning. This stuff is really important, and it's really hard to change, but it's at the core of what we do. Edgar Schein, famous organizational culture expert, has talked about how you can understand cultures through their artifacts, through their what's the word I'm looking for here? So it's just been a long day. Their underlying basic assumptions, and of course their espoused beliefs and values. Within the military services, and a great many specialties within them, there are a lot of different organizational cultures, but they're unified by unit cohesion and, to a great extent, the underlying basic assumptions about the act of service itself. Beyond those things, they become increasingly focused in ways that are shaped by their warfare domain, their service tradition, and the mission set that they deal with. Yet the basic underlying assumptions are the context in which military virtues are most relevant and most important, and that's where I'm going to focus. Military virtues in their practical expression make our military what it is. They're taught and venerated, demanded and punished in the breach, and despite the fact of their exact incarnation, relative importance, and practical effect, those things have varied over time. And I think it's interesting, we're halfway through the day, and we have yet, unless I blinked and missed it, heard what anyone would call a comprehensive list of military virtues. Because depending on how you look at it, some things are in or out of various lists. The services have their own articulated sets of values, which in some cases are the same as virtues. But depending on the era and the thinker, I think it's safe to say military virtues include honor, courage, loyalty, integrity, respect, selflessness, wisdom, justice, temperance, and especially in the operational constraint, especially in the operational context, restraint, discrimination, and proportionality. And we could spend the rest of the conference talking about any single one of those. But I want to talk a little bit now about how those values present themselves and how the future of the military tasks that our services are going to be called on to accomplish are likely to change. So I want to do a little thought experiment here. There we go. In the 1940s, we're all pretty well aware of the level of sacrifice in World War II. Against a specific kind of operation, tens of thousands of Allied aircraft Allied airmen were lost, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians that we opposed in Germany and Japan, simply for the purpose of destroying the enemy nation's infrastructure. The outcome of that effort, you can argue about, was uneven, but the cost was immense in terms of lives, destruction, and suffering. No nation wished to repeat those horrors or to suffer air attack of any kind. From the perspective of the American civilian, service at that time was voluntary for some, but compelled for most. Sacrifice was an expectation, and military success could be broadly defined as winning the war by defeating an enemy and keeping the United States from being attacked. If we then go forward to the 50s and 60s, when a nuclear-armed Soviet Union threatened North America with long-range bombers, the United States and Canada allied to create NORAD and provide long-range detection of attacking aircraft and air defense of North American infrastructure and population. These numbers will kind of surprise you, but the U.S. aerospace defense enterprise in that time grew to encompass over 100,000 people, a vast radar network, almost 1,500 air defense fighters, and more than 240 surface-to-air missile sites, all over the U.S. and Canada. We later developed the ability to detect ballistic missiles as they came into the Soviet arsenal. And while imperfect, even when it was fielded, this was a classical military response to a tangible challenge. In short, a physical threat emerged, a military response ensued, and a national security objective was achieved. From the military perspective, an opposing military force possessed potential capabilities. We developed countervailing military capabilities, and a shield was effectively created between what we value and those who would threaten it. From the civilian perspective, the criteria for success were deterrence of an enemy and, again, physical protection of American infrastructure and people. Even when ICBMs came on the scene and rendered that defense less effective, a physical destructive dynamic remained, and it was what we depended on to prevent violence. Now let's fast forward to the 2040s. We're already incredibly dependent on GPS and interlinked interactive data to sustain today's air traffic. And if you got to watch the news for any length of time in the last couple of days, you know that a Sabre software system caused great inconvenience for lots of people. Imagine a 9/11 style aircraft grounding that persisted not for days, but for months or weeks. 2 decades plus from now, let's also assume that industry will be successfully fielding a North American network of autonomous, mostly electrically powered ground vehicles. The dynamics of ensuring that that transportation network remains capable of carrying the commerce required to sustain this nation is different. Intellectual property rights, commercial incentives will largely determine the design of those vehicles and supporting systems. It's unclear right now who has responsibility or authority to actually defend against attack on their software, their sensors, or the electrical power grid that powers them. Economic disincentives will make it less likely that vehicles will be designed with backup means of operation, and future generations will not naturally develop the skills to navigate or control vehicles, particularly in a GPS-denied world. It's even less clear who will organize the collective understanding, national will, or mechanisms to design this system for resilience against adversary attack, much less solar flares or other things that could potentially interfere with it, or to decide that the potential costs of doing so outweigh the advantages. But it is crystal clear that our adversaries would find that system just as an attractive a target as we did in World War II when we attacked Nazi rail yards, and they could attack it without formations of bombers, and we cannot again solve the problem with an after-the-fact military defense based on lines on a map. Defending something as critical as the North American transportation network 50 years ago was nearly exclusively a military function. Defending it 50 years from now may be barely a military function. So I think this exercise illuminates a couple of points. First, it reminds us that professions, including the American profession of arms, have no birthright to any particular professional jurisdiction. Within the system of professions, changes in environment and technology and societal priorities, including politically generated organizations such as the Space Force discussion, drive those changes. Defending U.S. territory and infrastructure, as I mentioned, was once very clearly a military responsibility, but in the interconnected future we just discussed, whose responsibility will it be? And what, if any, military virtues do those guardians need to possess? Second, it highlights the fact that globalization, modernization, and interconnection have combined to strain our historically valid assumptions about the exclusivity of military force to ensure national prosperity and survival. And today, I would argue it's straining them toward the breaking point. And that poses a challenge to military virtues, too, casting some doubt on whether classical use of force is sufficiently instrumental to achieving the end that we all swear to, protecting the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Third, I'd say it hints at one current assumption of our national military establishment, reinforced by decades of tactical and operational success in force projection, that military virtues are intimately and almost exclusively connected with our ability to enable projection of force precisely and ethically with the greatest possible restraint and respect for the laws of armed conflict in order to be both morally sound and strategically effective in the wars that we have been fighting for the last several decades. And it reminds us that the context in which virtues are developed and esteemed or not can change. The setting in which military virtues evolved was once entirely tangible and accessible, well within the common imagination. In the ancient to early 20th century context, the warrior associated with a city, a village, a fiefdom, principality, or a nation state was a person, equipped with a weapon, operating in a definable formation, occupying a physical position, and the rules of the game were relatively simple for that reason. The operational world was, in systems engineering terms, a complicated system. Warfare between groups of sentient human beings has always been unpredictable in some sense, but the chessboard wasn't infinite, and each combatant's ties to more basic and less contested elements of Maslow's hierarchy, physiology and safety, was pretty comprehensible. So the evolving modern context, as I've mentioned, is entirely different in some respects. One of the most vexing problems is that for the organizational cultures of our military, including the values they espouse and the virtues they consider desirable, the modern face of conflict that we just talked about, it's not an or problem, it's an and problem. Half a century ago, Morris Janowitz predicted increased blurring between civil and military roles, and we're seeing that come to pass as civilians employ weapons of war and military personnel accomplish operational tasks that involve neither physical violence nor direct risk. He also presciently said, as in the past, the future of the military profession rests on a balance between organizational stability and adaptation to rapid technological and political change. Military leaders must be prepared to solve, or perhaps more accurately, to live with a series of dilemmas. New types of warfare do not eliminate older and even primitive forms. And that's a fancy, much more eloquent way of saying what I came up with, which is that in the future, combat's still going to be hand-to-hand, air-to-air, ship-to-ship, any other kind of violent reciprocal clash that we can all imagine, and many of us have seen firsthand. It will still be visceral, it will still be powerful, and it will capture the imagination of participants and the fascination of those who have anything to do with it. But it will be more, and as Dave Barno and Nora Bensal put it a couple of years ago, we're facing a new generation of unrestricted warfare that's hybrid warfare, it's cyber conflict, it's space warfare, where no human is likely to be, but where we all find a great deal of support. It's remote or autonomous, and it's well outside the comprehension of the average citizen, and I dare to say even outside the experience of many educated, elected, and appointed leaders. Because if you don't live with this stuff, the subtleties can elude you. And distance from common experience matters when we're talking about the military virtues of the future. It's yet another barrier to effective civil-military dialogue. Ed, should I fast forward to the next couple of paragraphs? Where are you? Yeah, I will. Yeah. Okay. I do want to return to the assumption that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. Interconnected, interdependent, high-velocity, multi-domain world that we live in is complex. And as Stan McChrystal wrote in Team of Teams, a complex system requires a different approach to manage it, centered on teams of teams with the right capability to manage components of the complex system and adapt rapidly and effectively when predictably unpredictable interactions occur. This may sound like just another layer, not that different from a complicated system, but it actually is quite different because the teams have to be different, and the values that they have, the experience they have, and potentially the virtues that they consider important are different. One way to conceive of that difference is with an image and a question. In 1815, the Battle of Waterloo, not that blank slide, and not that one. Ah, that was the one you were looking at. There we go.
Oh.
How long has that been up? Technology. All right. So for want of a nail, as we've all heard, it's not a horseshoe nail, it's a nail to spike a gun. A particular battle was lost. We could pick hundreds of similar historical examples where valorous individuals either influenced or failed to influence the outcome of a battle by their preparation or by their actions on time. In future conflict, though, I'd ask you, what's going to be that nail? What is that thing? And in the kind of complexity that we're talking about, I think it's almost impossible for any of us to identify that nail or that kind of thing that really makes a difference. Nor will it necessarily be in the possession of or the responsibility of a military person to have that nail to save that battle. Sean McCain just wrote a new book called New Rules of War that has some pretty interesting insights in it. When he talks about technology and cyber war, though, I think he and I have a difference of opinion. He acknowledges we need technology, but asserts we must not worship at his altar. I don't know exactly what that means, but where I think we need to really think about it is that we undervalue the ability of technology to make our society vulnerable. We can't wish that problem away. We have proven on the battlefields of today that taking us on in the traditional way is a bad idea. So our enemies, as we all know, are flocking to find ways to undermine who we are and what we do in ways that don't go head-to-head with that capability. So I want to take a look at our lexicon here. And I had a lot of words wrapped around these slides, but I want to give you the visual. Yes, they're actually up there. No, they didn't come out right. Let's build this up. Okay. We all understand the words on the right side. We use them all the time. They're very common. I've done Google searches in the past. Didn't think it was important to throw numbers at you. But when we talk about battlefield, when we talk to younger officers and enlisted folks about the battlefield, we all think we know what that means. My argument is that with regard to the context in which our virtues play out, the battlefield is changing. The battlefield could be a piece of silicon for some people. It could be a geosynchronous orbit for other people. It could be a shoot, no shoot decision after knocking on a door in the middle of the night for some people. It is much more complicated than it used to be. And so when we use words that have literally hundreds or thousands of years of historical meaning behind them, if we don't expand our conception of what those words actually mean, then the dialogue that we have internal to ourselves in our services and with those who are responsible for guiding and setting priorities for the military, which in this country are elected leaders, then we perhaps are not having the conversation we need to have about what we're doing. Having said that, it's really hard to forsake the terms on the left and embrace the terms on the right because they have almost no pathos involved with them. So, another couple of questions, and then I'll get off the stage and let Dr. French share with us. When we're talking about values, military virtues, in a world where nations can cripple or kill each other remotely, which I recognize is a debatable proposition, with little physical risk to the protagonist, how do we evolve the military and civil understanding of courage when adversaries can attack our infrastructure in tangible and surreptitious ways? Should the combatants reflect classical military virtues, or should they reflect the virtues that spies and saboteurs have? Where do they belong organizationally? What do we value more? Do we value valor because it's admirable, or do we value outcome? To a certain extent, you could argue it's a virtue versus consequentialist argument, but in common discourse with the civilians who depend on their services to protect them, they typically verbally acknowledge sacrifice. They typically don't judge outcome. I think that's probably context specific. How do we learn to recognize courage, the exercise of moral courage, for example, in folks who don't go toe-to-toe with an enemy? If you were here a couple of years ago, I talked a little bit about the Distinguished Warfare Medal, which was an attempt to do that, and I think its brief rise and extremely rapid disappearance says that we don't yet value an outcome if it doesn't involve risk, quite the same way that we do with those who are in the fight personally. If our nation is attacked on a larger scale than 9/11, this is the context point that I mentioned a moment ago, I think our fellow citizens would value our sacrifice less and value our results more. And so our virtues probably should not be defined purely as a result of public sentiment if they're truly virtues and they're things that are important. But the public sentiment does affect how they support us and how they see those virtues. Do we tend to major on what we like and what we know, or are we fully embracing, not just at the organizational and intellectual level, but at the emotional and the ethos level, the challenges that the nation faces? And do our traditional organizations stand as a barrier to thinking through the larger national security context? And I go back to that thought experiment. If you look at our nation as a system of systems to be defended and not as a power projection platform from which to send force out to proactively improve our security, then I would argue that we may be ripe for relooking at the way we're wired together. Loyalty. Loyalty is a powerful thing. It's a wonderful thing. Between individual human beings, it can be pretty amazing, and in small groups, it's incredibly powerful. The question is, do we need to take that to another level so that anyone who is at the point of contact with another organization where there's a mutual dependency to achieve a productive national security outcome, how do we have the same kind of intensity in those relationships that makes it work at a unit level in the military, as we all know, that then operates at a more strategic level in a more complex environment? Here's kind of a trivial one, but the old military virtue of obedience. We talk about mission command. That's no surprise to anybody that with the appropriate commander's intent, smart young folks of all ranks have gone forth and done great things in years past. But in a world that is always connected and that is nodal as well as hierarchical, how do we construe the virtue of obedience, and what does that look like day to day when people are getting information that their superiors and perhaps their peers don't even have? So it's not that the value or the virtue is questionable, it's just that it may look very different. And so back to where I started, if we can answer these questions, we have a good chance of retaining the jurisdiction we have and doing the things we do better. If we cannot, then we run the risk of either losing jurisdiction, losing missions, or failing. And that, I would argue, is a pretty serious source of potential moral injury. To sum up and turn it over to Shannon, our conception of war and warriors is truly under pressure, and I would argue we need to think deeply and act purposefully to make sure that our most deeply held assumptions, which explicitly include what we consider to be military virtues, yield the kinds of people and organizations that can prevail in new as well as old kinds of conflict. My fellow panelist enjoined us that the essential element of a warrior's code is that it must set definite limits on what warriors can and cannot do if they want to continue to be regarded as warriors, not murderers, cowards, or monsters. And I absolutely agree with that, 100%. I also think an American warrior's code for the future must honor those restraints where it's appropriate, but expand and empower our conception of what warriors do and who they are, if we're to avoid the greatest moral injury of all, which is failing to defend the nation we love against those who would do it harm and don't care about our virtues, our ethos, or our tradition. Thank you.
If you will allow me a very brief moment of sentiment as I am up here, especially the midshipmen in the room wouldn't know this, but I used to teach here. I taught in Luce Hall from 1997 to 2008, and this was my home, and I have to say when I was driving over the bridge with my husband and daughter yesterday, they said, "How's it feel to be back?" And I said, it feels like coming home. So it's wonderful to be here. I want to thank the whole team at the Stockdale Center. And of course, it's also particularly meaningful, this first McCain conference after the passing of Senator McCain. We mentioned my Code of the Warrior book, the original version of that came out in 2003. He wrote the foreword for that. And that meant a great deal to me, particularly because the staffer who gave it to me said that he wrote it himself, the way only a staffer can admit that maybe that doesn't always happen, but he said he wrote it himself. And then, appropriately enough, when we redid the book and added and expanded it to deal with some of these changes we're talking about, in 2017, the new foreword was written by our own Joe Thomas, who is now running the Stockdale Center. So I'm very grateful to be here in that context, and I appreciate all of you. Now, a somewhat sadder context is that I just learned that on Tuesday, a pretty amazing man passed away, and it was someone I had just talked about. I was giving a talk on Monday at Fort Leavenworth down in Kansas, and I was talking about a fellow named Andy Marshall, and I don't know, some folks in the room are nodding, you know who I'm talking about. Andy Marshall, he was amazing. He was a man who sat at the heart of the Pentagon, like a spider in a web drawing insight. And he lured people there in the best possible sense to get brains from every which corner of the world to really try to tackle the very thing that we're here struggling with, and that is, what is the future of war going to look like? I wasn't myself one of Andy's famed futurists, but because I was working at the Naval Academy at the time and had friends who were in his group, I had the opportunity to actually attend one of his futurist briefings at the Pentagon. And that one was actually titled China 2025. Huh. And I remember that at the time they were studying Chinese demographic changes. They were studying things like the growing gender imbalance that was occurring because of the one-child policy. They were concerned about environmental issues and resource strains from the population, modernization, pollution, and examples of possible flashpoints like Taiwan or the South China Sea. They were wondering about tank warfare again and titanium submarines. But you heard the years that I was here, so then, of course, 9/11 happened. And everything changed. And there was Operation Enduring Freedom, and Operation Iraqi Freedom, and no freedom at all from the grim grinding of the forever wars in which we are still engaged. And the terms kept changing. US forces were avengers, and then they were liberators, and then they were occupiers. And then they were, I should say they are, managing complex asymmetric counterinsurgencies while still hunting terrorists and trying not, with whatever success, to get sucked into unsustainable nation building. And all the focus, all the training had to be about that. And that's what everyone talked about. And people weren't talking about China 2025 anymore until Marshall and his heirs got loud again with their warnings and the reminder that we can't always prepare to fight the last war. the US military could not prepare for whatever comes next, while recognizing by that very example that we often don't know. So now they're looking at large-scale combat operations again, while also wondering, as we've just begun, about new high-tech threats in cyber and AI and bioenhancement. They're trying to get ready for what comes next. Now, I've already said I'm not a futurist, I'm a military ethicist, and so I make no claims to know the future. I don't know what our next war will be. But I do know, and I will personally fight any revisionists in the room who don't agree. I do know that whatever we face, we will still need the principles of the original just war tradition. We're still going to need them to help figure it out, no matter how much changes. And this echoes something that you brought up, Sir. There's nothing really that new under the sun. Plus, the old school kinds of fighting, as you said, will continue to happen. I found myself, when you said that, thinking about how we've seen now images of a drone being hit by a spear, or a drone being taken down by a trained falcon. So we cannot assume that technology is going to change everything. And it certainly won't. And so we will still need to have the considerations that we have always worried about in a forefront of our mind. Considerations like just cause, right intention, just means, legitimate authority, probability of success is certainly a tricky one, last resort, all of that will still matter. Responses will still have to be proportional, enough to restore peace, and the civilian immunity must still be maintained if possible, because holding that line, and this is something you also referenced, holding that line is actually worth dying for. Sounds strange to say you would die for a principle that says that it matters how you kill people. But that is exactly what we're talking about here, because that is the line that establishes the difference between what soldiers do and what terrorists or murderers do. And that's the core of the profession of arms. And as we've been talking about all day here, if that dissolves, what dissolves with it are the souls of the people who fight. That is a truly devastating moral injury, and it's worth resisting. That's been understood, as we've also heard here today, for eons, and it isn't going to change, no matter what else changes in war. And I think it does help, and it's comforting and somewhat grounding to recognize that there's quite a lot about armed conflict that is timeless, because human nature doesn't change. And even though people are constantly innovating and creating new technology, we can find touchstones in the past to connect to that new technology, to give us a sense of how the people we admire have handled them in the past, or conversely, looking back at Jessica's excellent lunchtime keynote, how people we do not admire have failed in the past and how we cannot replicate that. And so, for example, as we think about things coming up, you said we were going to make people uncomfortable. I'm down with that. Let's continue to make people uncomfortable. I work in this area a lot now, and the things coming down the pike are worrisome. There's no doubt about it. But when you stop and think, okay, well, what about killer robots? I get a lot of questions around the killer robots question. Autonomous killing machines, Terminators of some sort. But one thing that's helpful to remember is we already have autonomous killing machines. We all know this. You just have to pause and think for a second, but we have for again, many years. Perhaps one of the useful analogies is landmines. It's not the only one. But it's helpful because landmines are particularly ethically interesting. And so thinking of killer robots in terms of the way we think about landmines is helpful and prevents us from wasting time reinventing the wheel. So when you look at the ethics of landmines, there are international forces and groups that absolutely want them outright banned, which is happening right now with robots. There's actually a group called Ban Killer Robots. So this is a push. What, they didn't want to be unclear about what they were for, ban killer robots. But of course, the US has not signed on to a lot of this, and we still use landmines in certain circumstances. But if you think of the way that we try to contain that, it perhaps gives us guidance going forward towards how to deal with killer robots. So for example, if we use landmines, we feel a moral burden, as well as a practical one, to know where we put them, to have control of them, to be able to go back and get them and return them to our control. So if you take that into this context of what robots we could ever field, we could not have them that would violate those constraints. We could not have them in such a way that they might not be retrievable when the conflict is over, or that they might go off in ways that we don't expect against our own troops or against civilians. Landmines are dangerous precisely because if you leave them there, then innocent people, even years, decades later, can stumble upon them and be injured or killed. We don't want to introduce something without the recognition that this has that weight that we've seen in the past and we've seen the harm of when we've seen landmines. Let me take another example. Bioenhancement is something that is much talked of now with many moves towards making super soldiers of some sort, or super Marines, or super sailors, or super airmen. And again, that sounds super new and cutting edge, like, oh, there must not be a historical analogy available to talk about bioenhancement. But of course there is. And my personal favorite is Celtic warp spasmers. What, that didn't come to everybody's mind immediately? Celtic warp spasmers? Okay, I'm weird, but that's what came to my mind. And the reason is that these were shock troops that were enhanced before battle. And the reason it's relevant and intriguing is that there's concern about bioenhanced troops perhaps being seen as disposable, seen as we put extra money and training into you to make you able to endure things that other people can't endure. So while initially we might think, gosh, you're expensive, we should keep you safe, as soon as we deploy you successfully, we're going to start saying, well, that was useful. Let's go to them all the time. I mean, think about how that's happened with special forces. You think, oh, let's go to that well, let's go to that well. And maybe not care so much about what happens to them. See them as a resource that you use up. The other thing that's true about these Celtic warp spasmers is you didn't invite them back home afterwards. There were understood risks that once they used some kind of cocktail, we're not sure exactly what, to soup them up. And then you couldn't let them back amongst civilians because you had changed them in such a way that their integration wasn't possible. So this shows us, well, so if we're going to bioenhance troops in various and sundry ways, what are the questions we have to ask? We have to start talking about, can you have an unenhanced officer in charge of enhanced troops? Can you have integrated groups that are enhanced and unenhanced? Are we going to take enhancements back? When I was at Leavenworth, some of the Army guys were talking about how, anything the Army gives you, they're going to want back, and they're going to want it back clean. And so, we insert a cyborg-style special kind of eye into you, and at the end of the day, we rip it back out and say, here's your civilian eye, sir. It sounds funny, but as you think of it, it isn't funny at all, and it isn't that hard to imagine that you would have enhancements that were temporary. I am aware, as some of you will be, you track these things, of some of the projects that DARPA's working on right now. And there's one that's called the TNT project. Some of you may have heard of this. And long story short, what it is primarily about is ways to use neural stimulation, poking in your brain, to enhance certain skills in a rapid way. So for example, they're looking at improving marksmanship more quickly by direct neurostimulation. Now, in thinking about that, I think we should have a moment of pause and worry. Because one of the things that was raised in looking at this project is, would this be something you would do temporarily or permanently, and would the effects be temporary or permanent? And some of the researchers who were asked, who were still working on animals and so forth, said, well, actually, some of the changes might not only be permanent, they may be heritable. That's right, so you would change people in order for them to serve, and then it would pass down to their children. I see some of your faces going, I'm sorry, what? What did we sign on to? So in asking about these changes that might happen, we have to ask the kind of questions that we have understood in the past, but may have actually slipped our mind temporarily, about what do we owe to the future generations of people that we ask to fight, who, if given the choice, are not going to view informed consent the way you might do in a standard bioethics context, but are going to say, if this gives me an edge that will help keep the people with me alive, of course I'm going to say yes. But is it fair to them, ethically speaking, to have them do a procedure they're going to pass down to their children? particularly when, as in that case, one of the worries is that if you improve marksmanship by that particular kind of brain tinkering, you might accidentally, and I know Nancy will care about this, you might accidentally tune down empathy. Oops. So do we want to allow changes that are meant to solve one problem to create other problems? We've seen that happen in the past, and we have to have our eye on the ball. Now, what does all this have to do with what we're talking about in terms of virtue, what we're talking about with warrior virtues for the future? Well, I'm hoping you've gotten a hint of it, but we're talking to some very experienced leaders, but also future leaders here in the room. And the virtues that you're going to need as a future leader in light of these kind of changes, and I haven't even gotten into AI, but I'm going to say something briefly about that as well. One of the main things you're going to need is the ability to speak up and dissent in the face of, you quoted Sean McCain saying, we must not worship at Tech's altar. Mm-hmm. There will be a lot of people worshiping at Tech's altar. In light of AI, the developments in AI have already pushed the DoD to think essentially like an arms race. We have to get ahead of other powers or near peers. We have to get ahead of China and maybe even Russia and others to keep our edge. But that means potentially deploying things sooner than they should, and it is going to be the leaders in this room who might be the ones who have the moment to voice for the people that they have both power over and power to protect, that says, no, we cannot listen to the system in this case. And let me tell you what I mean. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a tendency in humans at the moment, I'm kind of hoping we can get past this, but at the moment, to defer to automated systems. It's called automation bias. Those of you who study this are well familiar with it. But it might be more severe than you're aware. And I want you to think of it as a leadership challenge. Because this automation bias, let me give you an example. A researcher, Linda Skitka, did a study using a flight simulator. And it showed that in a test environment with an automated computer aid that the participants were specifically told was not infallible. They were specifically told that it made mistakes. Participants would, more often than not, trust the computer over not only their own instincts, but the other analog instruments in the cockpit, even when they were told that those instruments had a much higher success rate. They still listened to the automation. That's what automation bias is. I mean, we see it in jokes and commercials, this person who follows the GPS into a lake. But unfortunately, it's not that funny when it's in this kind of context. And the percentages are really very worrisome because these are smart people. These are people who ought to know their systems. Here's an example, too. Participants in an environment with an automated flight aid only noticed 59% of problems announced by the automated aid, whereas participants without any automated aid noticed 97% of the same problems. So if you hear me, people are getting de-skilled by some of this automation, and that needs to worry all of us. We won't be able to put these genies back in the bottle, but we need moral courage in our young leaders to be able to say, I don't believe the computer, and we're not going to do what it says in this instance. Because, of course, there are some instances, and we already know of these, where the system itself will make an error. But I can even invent one based on what we heard the soup describe this morning. That situation with the MiGs, do we really think that for sure an automated system wouldn't have gone simply along the ROEs as he described them and fired? Seems quite likely to me. So it would have taken this extra bit of character, this extra bit of martial virtue to not only say we're not going to fire today, but also we're not going to fire today when whatever the blinking light or the automated system is saying, I'm getting ready to fire. I'm going to override that system and not allow that to happen is an extra bit of moral courage that's going to be needed by our future leaders. And there's many examples also, and I won't get into this because of time, but happy to talk about it in Q&A, of bias, regular old human bias, back to nothing new under the sun, being baked into these systems. So if we don't have people who are willing to think for themselves, to be creative and open and reflect on the complexity of human-to-human interactions in combat-type scenarios, we're going to have people simply having their biases confirmed. So if they see someone coming towards them, I know he's somewhere here in the room, but Mitt Regan, and there you are, Mitt. Mitt and Kevin Mullaney have done such amazing work around dissecting like a single event in Haditha, understanding what led to that. We could look at that and say, well, what if you had an AI system there that was also analyzing that scenario for you live in the moment? And they're working on these systems right now. And was giving you information about whether the people coming at you were hostile or not. What would that do to the judgment of the Marines or whomever else is in that context? And we need to actually be training people, not just in the traditional military ethics, but in how this ethics is going to interact with the unique psychological pressures that are going to come from these kind of new technologies. And I know we're here also to speak about moral injury, and there's another kind of moral injury that I think we need to address here. There's already been, I have to say, I find this disturbing, there's already been an acronym assigned to something that hasn't really happened yet, and that just means they've already decided to embrace that this is going to be a thing. And that acronym is PEDS, P-E-D-S, and it stands for Post-Enhancement Distress Syndrome. So if you're thinking about, again, in future leadership roles, the idea of, you asked what virtues do the guardians need to possess? If you are in any kind of position of greater power and the people under you are being asked to take on some kind of enhancement, and as I said earlier, they're going to say yes, and you have the opportunity to say, they don't need this, or the cost of this is too great, having the fortitude and the integrity to push back against that, instead of just accepting a new kind of trauma, a new kind of perhaps betrayal from the institution, is going to be very, very important. I was very moved at this event I was at Leavenworth when one of the speakers from the audience, and these were mid-career Army officers, said, and you could hear from his voice that he spoke from deep experience. He said, you're talking about things like future costs to families and veterans because of these new systems. And we had a person up there who had on the panel who was speaking about real details of some things like gene editing and so forth, and CRISPR and all that. And so this gentleman from the audience, he said, but right now, we already send people back to their families with various kinds of moral injury. We send them back struggling in various ways that can lead to harm across generations, and we're not doing enough about that. Could we possibly solve those problems first? Now, I couldn't promise him that we were going to solve those problems first, but one thing I could say is maybe this is a chance. If people are going to turn towards what's shiny and new and look at these new bioenhancements and so forth, to ask these bigger, broader questions and say, we need to do a good job planning ahead and making sure that we take care of people that we might alter in these various ways. And while we're thinking about that, how else can we take care of people that we change, that go through this experience and are changed by it? What else can we do to wrap around them in a better way so that the people that we need most in the crisis are actually given some kind of soft landing when and if they are privileged enough to return? It's the old Rudyard Kipling poem, it's Tommy this and Tommy that. But at the end of the day, nobody cares about Tommy, and we need to make sure that we're not part of that problem. So I look around this room at these young midshipmen, and I hope that you are hearing me and are thinking about what would you do if there's a command from above that says, do this, do that, to try to be the voice that says, all right, I understand I can't stop these changes, but I need you to work with me about how to make sure that they are not going to destroy the people who have pledged everything already. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we started about 10 minutes late, so let's go ahead and take some time for questions right now. Please, sir.
don't know if you can hear me now. So you talked about enhancement. There's a lot of interesting research out now about the Germans when they executed Blitzkrieg. The first attack into,
They were on crystal meth.
they were.
Yeah.
But all the way up and down the chain of command. So it wasn't a question of the soldiers being enhanced and the officers not being. And what happens when that occurs, other than the obvious, they have a lot of energy, is that they're awake. And they're awake for 72 hours. And they got inside of every single staff function of the enemy that they couldn't exist because they had to.
I mean, didn't Rommel actually get ahead of everybody?
What happens is, if you don't sleep for 15, 18, 20 hours, you begin to exhibit signs as if you're drunk.
Yep.
And so it became that, so there's a lot of real rich research into exactly what happened. And then at the end of that, when they finally stopped the offensive, they simply took all the drugs away from the troops and the officers, and that was it. They said, okay, we've had our fun for the last 5 days and it's done and over with. So just a thought on that.
Well, just briefly, if I could respond, I just want to say two things. One, of course, you're right, and sleep deprivation has also historically been used as torture, so we know that it does bad things to a person. But what you're pointing out to me is this same theme of we have to make sure we're not solving the wrong problem. The problem wasn't that they weren't moving fast enough. They needed to move fast in a deliberate way, and so in that case, the crystal meth solution did not lead to the right thing. And this was my worry, too, with one particular adaptation of that TNT program. It's too early, and we'll see how they do with it. But if they solve the marksmanship problem, but somehow accidentally, in an extreme version, kill off empathy, then we have less empathetic but better shooters. That's not the problem we were trying to solve. You have to ask the right questions and solve the right problems.
If you look at what happened with the German army when they did that, you might say tactically and operationally that was a successful tactic.
Only short term.
But regardless, it allowed them to roll almost in pairs.
This is where I get angry at the whole OODA loop thing. First is not always best.
Well, it depends on what your metric of success is. That's the
True.
first thing. The second thing is, you keep talking about AI and what it's going to do. I think that what we need to think about is that, look, it's coming, and it's going to be machine learning. All this is going to happen. What we need to do, the operators, the users, we need to get involved at the front end when they're writing the algorithms and determining what is important, what is not important, and the kind of connections that the AI is going to make with the sensory feeds that it's getting. So that you don't have this issue where you're relying on the technology yet don't know how it works. You remember a few years ago there was an Israeli patrol in Gaza, and one of them was captured and taken prisoner, a young lieutenant, and it turns out he was using Waze to help the patrol navigate through Gaza, and Waze wasn't quite accurate. And so that has to do with the fact that he didn't understand, you can't blame him, what the algorithms were that was driving that, why it said go left instead of right. So that's just
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I would say that the idea of allowing all of these systems to be, we used this term earlier, but black boxes is not sustainable either, because they have to be set up in such a way, and then there is work being done to achieve this, where the operators can actually ask questions like, you're telling me that these are combatants, not non-combatants. On what grounds are you telling me that? So if it's some data that they shoot back at you and you say, oh, actually that's no longer true, they no longer act that way or use that way, then you could disregard it. It's sort of teaching us again not to think machines are fallible, but to interact with them. So they're just augmenting us, they're not replacing us.
that interaction, I would suggest, is not going to happen. It's going to move so quickly, machine to machine, that if we don't get involved in the front end, we are going to forfeit the ability to, and there will be no human in the loop. That's where this thing goes. So, and the last point that you mentioned.
Sir, if I could, we have a number of hands up, and I hate to interrupt the dialogue, but if you could hold some of those for one-on-one, we'd sure appreciate it. Other hands?
Do we-
Sir.
Do we have some mids we could get in the,
Yeah, please.
Yeah, there's one back there.
yeah, there you go.
Good afternoon, I'm Midshipman Anthony Perry, and this is sort of directed at Dr. French, but in general, if you have anything, I'd be more than happy to listen. So I'm a cyber operations major here at the Academy, and I just wanted to ask either of you if you had any foreseeable estimations what some of the issues that we might, ethical issues we might be facing as we try to use direct cyber attacks such as WannaCry or Not Touch It or something of the like. Thank you.
I'll take a quick stab, and then you could help me out when I run out of stuff. I mean, I would say one of the things that's obviously been discussed, I'm sure you're already thinking about this, is at what point do we feel like we have enough of a grip on the attribution side that we can be confident responding directly to cyber attacks. And one of the biggest problems in a lot of the cases that we've dealt with is if you can't figure out where it came from, you're going to punish the wrong people. And certainly if you're talking about a kinetic attack in response, that gets really ethically dicey. You find out you're attacking it was just a zombie bot and it had no real connection at all. But even if you do find the right people, are you attacking in such a way, you're going to want to use the same type of resources, like I mentioned at the beginning, that we've had in the past. Are you attacking in such a way that's going to harm too many non-combatants? Are you going to be taking out systems that are going to affect other places? A lot of that is already established in our understandings of discrimination and proportionality, but you just have to map it onto the cyber world. So if I take out where the source of this attack was with my own virus, first of all, am I now releasing a virus that's going to be easily copied in a way that's going to cause blowback that I don't want? That would be maybe parallel to using chemical weapons or biological weapons that you can't contain after you've released them, hence the virus language. So we can use analogies from the past there as well. And then if you're thinking about striking back in ways, are they targeted enough, just as we talk about precision weapons? Or are they going to leak into systems we don't want to harm, like a hospital system or an air traffic control system? So all of those same questions you would have about a bombing run in many ways end up being cyber questions as well. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, my two-word answer would have been unintended consequences. And the footnote to that reference what General Schmidl was talking about. As AI develops, there are obviously different kinds of AI. There's AI that we understand well and how it works, and there's AI that sort of writes its own algorithms, which become non-transparent. And so when multiple non-transparent systems start talking to each other, then I think the challenge for the cyber operator will be to understand, if I do X, what is the range of consequences that I can create? Are they worth the benefit? The same questions that Dr. French just asked about, good old-fashioned laws of armed conflict and human considerations for, am I doing the right thing?
We get one more mid in here. Can you guys combine your? Go ahead.
Dr. French, Adam Beethman, thanks for talking to us today. So my question is coming regards to some of those personal enhancements. It seems like Americans would be very in tune with this idea. Like Captain America, superpowered taking steroids, and he's my personal favorite. But I'm worried about the idea of this being a genetic trait that could be passed on. If a large enough proportion of society did have these genetic enhancements and then passed it down to their children, we're now creating a different class of society. We're creating a group of genetically elite individuals, and I don't quite see how they would. I'm worried about the consequences of how that interacts down the road. Once you create a large enough plurality of individuals who have these different capabilities and who are very genetically different than their peers around them, how does that function within society maintain on the broader picture, not just within the military, but within societal function as a whole?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have all these sci-fi references now floating in my brain. At the moment, I'm thinking Starship Troopers. Would you like to learn more? But yes. But the worry is that the more that these changes would occur, and as you're discussing it also in terms of heritable traits, how would we start to say, well, all of our leaders should have the enhancements because obviously they're better, so we would want the enhanced leaders, and then it becomes, well, really, should we let anyone vote who isn't enhanced? Enhancement obviously is superior. You could just easily imagine this coming very close to that kind of idea. Other sci-fi references in my mind would be things like Gattaca and stuff like that, where you gene edit until you get to a place where people are seen as just drones to everyone else who has these cool enhancements. And the point of a lot of the stories with that is that what I think worries people the most is not that we would actually make these transhuman, that's the term that gets used a lot, transhumanism, that we would make these transhuman evolved people that would be so much better, but that they actually wouldn't be. They would have the same fallibilities that we all have. And so we would simply be empowering people in a way that would corrupt them. You know, the whole absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, what's cool about Captain America is he's such a nice guy, right? So you can give him these powers and it's not going to destroy him. But in most circumstance, we worry that if you enhanced a large group of people, they would seize power and that power would corrupt them and they would put other people down. And this has so many flaws for society in general, including that what we can't see is the person who we judge to be non-enhanced, who has some brilliance, who has some capacity. We dismiss that person, and that's the person that we actually needed to solve this problem. And we have a long, nasty history of that as a human race, of dismissing entire groups of people as second-class citizens, and then missing out, even from a selfish perspective, on all the great things they could have done if we didn't hide them in the shadows. So I'm very against the idea of that kind of stratified society, but I do worry about it. And I do think that it's only going to increase the very negative things that we see right now with gaps in wealth and other kinds of gaps around the world, gaps in health and access to services of various kinds, and even what we see with climate change, where the countries that are producing the most problems are actually not the ones suffering the most from the problems they're creating. So I think I do want to see more people work on the justice elements of what could happen if these kind of enhancements are moved forward. But if there is going to be any protection for us, it's going to be making sure that they travel side by side with these character issues, so that if we're enhancing anybody, we're pre-selecting the Captain Americas and not the, I don't know, Banes or whatever. Now I'm really switching universes.
Dr. Luban, I'm sorry, we're out of time. Forgive me for that. Sir, did you want to add anything?
Nope.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm over here because though Dr. French has a very agile mind, obviously her leg, which is broken in 3 places, is a little less so. So let me come over here and say on behalf of the Stockdale Center, Ed, thank you for letting me say that. Congratulations and thank you. It's a black box filled with something.
Oh, very cool.
Sir. Thanks
That's
very much.
gorgeous.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you.
please join me in thanking the